Hello and welcome, dear friends, in this 16th year of the Turner Winter Series. I'm Maureen Rovegno, proud and grateful to serve as Director for Religion at Chautauqua Institution, and grateful to have been associated with the Turner Winter Series these many years. We come to you for today's conversation, traditionally held at Chautauqua, with great appreciation to be here in the socially distancing capacity of the Kappa Theater in the Robert H. Jackson Center, this year virtually in a format to which we have all become quite accustomed in this time of COVID. It is my great pleasure to begin today's conversation with a brief introduction of our guest, Dr. Lillian Ney, after which I will turn the conversation over to our perennial host and the founder of this series, Jamestown's and the Jackson Center's own Greg Peterson. Today's conversation is a wonderful opportunity to celebrate one of our Chautauqua region's most beloved citizens. So, let me tell you a little something about Lilian Ney. A fellow physician once described Dr. Ney as a hero, even back in med school. Following her retirement from a successful cardiology practice and administrative roles at the local hospital, she dove into the volunteer world headfirst. Dr. Ney has served on the board of the United Way, the Area Youth Orchestra, our local professional theater, the Jamestown Concert Association, a family counseling center, the American Heart Association, the Visiting Nurses Association, and the Chautauqua Health Network, just to name a few. She has worked toward the revitalization of downtown Jamestown, serving on the Jamestown Renaissance Board, Jamestown Strategic Planning Board, chair of the Board of Public Utilities, as well as the board of Jamestown Community College, and as president of the Gebby Foundation. And I am personally privileged to have served with Lil when we were both on the Board of Trustees at the Chautauqua Institution. Lilian Ney has won awards too numerous to recite here, and she has received recognition by both the New York State and United States governments. Her example of leadership, hard work, and compassion has made her the ideal role model for women and for everyone, everywhere, and her service through the years has been described understatedly as improving the quality of life for everyone in every way in our region. She was named Woman of the Year in 2001, but she could have worn that title in any given year before and since. Lillian understands and has worked consistently for improved access to health, education, the arts, and culture by serving on boards, yes, but also by getting down into the trenches to help organizations deliver programs and services. She has rightfully been called a woman for all seasons. I could say much more, but I will leave it to Greg to help us get to know more fully the amazing person that Lilian Ney is. And so, it is now my great pleasure to welcome in conversation Dr. Lilian Ney and Greg Peterson.
So Dr. Ney, Dr. Lillian Ney, we just listened to an incredible introduction by your good friend Maureen Rovegno. I watched you kind of sitting quietly, listening to many things that have been accomplished. Here we are in April 15th, 2021 at the Kappa Theater. And as you listened to that, what were you thinking?
Well, I was getting a little tearful. First of all, Maureen and I are good friends, old friends, and in a way been through a lot of things together through the years, issues that happened at Chautauqua and strategic planning for Chautauqua and things like that. But I guess in a way I've forgotten some of the early things that I had been involved with many years ago, the Heart Association and the visiting nurses and so on and so forth. So, and when you take the time or hear somebody remind you of the things that happened through your life, it's it's sort of touching. In fact, it's quite touching, and it's a little bewildering in a way. By the way, I was wondering where she got the information, all that information, but I can talk to her later and ask her.
Well, I don't know where she got it because she does her own work. I don't.
Oh, I believe it, yeah.
And she's very good. But I must tell you, when the word leaked out that we were going to interview you today, several sources sent me information.
Oh,
Yeah, because
wow.
I don't, we can talk about that offline. When I think of Lillian Ney, I think of, we're at the Kappa Theater, and immediately comes to mind is you being the president of the Gebby Foundation in the 1999-2000 time period, and your friend Carl Kappa, Betty Ney, myself, Dan Bratton, had a crazy idea about a Robert Jackson Center. And the Gebby Foundation was the very first foundation to support us. Do you remember much about the conversations back in that time period?
Well, in those days, I think our executive director was the one directly
Tom, yeah.
and initially involved. And the board then, of course, heard about it as the plans unraveled. And, you know, it didn't take much for the Gebby Foundation to appreciate the importance of certain things coming down the line. Chautauqua, it definitely was one. I've always thought that the jewels of Chautauqua County, the Gebby could spot before they started shining and really shined them up. One of them was Chautauqua, JCC, Roger Torrey Peterson, and the library and the Audubon. But the Jackson Center was like perfect because it fit right into the jewels and something that needed to be preserved and helped to prosper. And then I'm going to get to the coffee at Chautauqua because I can't help it, because as things progressed, my husband and I were very close friends of the president of Chautauqua at the time, Daniel Bratton. And I knew he was a good friend of Sandra Day O'Connor. So that's why you and I had coffee, because I wanted you to know that as this was flourishing here, oh, excuse me, Ed, as this was flourishing, the idea and all that, I thought, oh my goodness, you know, and I knew that she was off-season often at Chautauqua because she loved it there, and her husband did too, and I think they had a home there even in the vicinity. So anyway, I wanted you to talk to him and tell him about this idea, and of course, as I recall, you did. You must have, because he was very excited about it. And then eventually, you know, she was there for, as I remember, the statue,
Right.
when the statue was put into place, which the Gebby Foundation, I remember we went through various scenarios and picked a sculpture and things like that. Unusual things, in a way, to be talking about at a board meeting, but, and thanks to you, Carl Kappa and Betty Ney were right there, and it was, when people work together, wonderful things happen.
The statue itself, which is now in front of the Robert Jackson Center, but that was originally placed for the camera at Love School, commissioned through, certainly Gebby encouraged it and funded it, and I think they had a contest to decide how they would memorialize Jackson. Were you part of that committee that decided?
Honestly, as I remember, it was a whole board,
What is it?
which is a small board anyway, so
Yeah.
it wasn't like there were millions of people, probably 8 or 9 at the time, yeah. Yeah, so it was very exciting. So I was there that day. I loved that day. It was spectacular, and there was all kinds of room there on the corner.
Right.
And so it was very, very exciting. I'll never forget that one.
Yeah, that's my, Justice O'Connor spoke, of course, and that brings a crowd in and of itself. And and that was my inspiration, frankly, for ultimately ending up with this Jackson Center. When you have a justice of the Supreme Court telling me you should be very proud of your Jamestown, New York native, and
Yeah.
yeah, well, I guess we should, and hence we were. And what I remember also, aside from that coffee where you encouraged me, was you were on the board of Chautauqua. We had just started, 2001. We bought the building, and we were just stumbling along with a building that was in tough shape. And you called me on behalf of Chautauqua. And I don't know what string you pulled, but you said, Greg, you need to be on the Hall of Philosophy agenda, 2001, and talk about the Jackson Center. Now, I don't know who you called, but you called me, and next thing you know,
That was the first Chautauqua lecture,
Yeah.
was it? Yeah.
you were
I did.
responsible for that, and that was ultimately ended up being the first introduction to Chautauqua of John Barrett.
Yes. You're reminding me of a few things from the past, yeah.
So John, who has had a long-standing relationship, but that was the
Oh,
reason.
yes.
I had been asked through you to do it, and I said, oh, okay, I don't even know how to spell Jackson, but I guess if Dr. Ney thinks it's important, and she's got me on the agenda, I'll do it. But I was panicked because I needed somebody, so I reached out to a Nuremberg prosecutor, a guy named Ted Fenstermacher, who was actually there. And he was scheduled to come to be the real person. I would do the introduction, rah, he would do the rest. A week before, he called and he was in the hospital, sick, couldn't make it. So now it's me.
Yeah, because you gave the lecture, I recall.
Well, most of it, but I called John Barrett, who I just had met, saying, John, you got to bail me out here. You got to be able to add some value. And he did, at a moment's notice, and that was the beginning. So 20 years now, it's
Oh, wow.
Lillian Ney created an environment which led to John Barrett.
Well, and the other thing I knew quite well, and you obviously did too, but that Dan was a good friend of Sandra Day O'Connor.
Yes.
I mean, personal friend. I mentioned that earlier, but then there were the keys to the museum in Washington that Dan said, Greg, oh dear, sorry. Greg has open access to the archives.
Yep.
Via Sandra Day O'Connor. So that was a very cool thing that came together so
Yeah.
nicely, yeah.
Very quickly, but you're in the middle of that.
Well, Dan and you were in the middle of it. I was just offering to have coffee that day, but it all worked out anyway. And the Gebby, like I mentioned earlier, always knew something special. If something was very special, they could see it. They could see it for the future. So that was the beauty of working with the Gebby in those
Well,
days.
you were not only on the board for 20-some years, but also its leader for many, many years. So thank you on many fronts. When I also think of Lilian Ney, I think of Bob Ney. And I also think of, in reading his obituary, I learned a lot. And I learned that he was born in Stuttgart
That's correct.
and Jewish, and that he was born in 1930 and then left in 1938 to go to England.
Right.
Was he one of those Jewish children who had to immigrate to England? That was fairly frequent.
Well, I think I'm going to be able to remember this accurately. He went to stay and live with his aunt and uncle in England. And their family is still there. In fact, I visited them about 15, 16 months ago for a short time in London. Yeah, they had emigrated there and lived there, and he went to stay with them. His father actually would have been a World War I starred person, whatever happens in the military. He had very high honors and was given the equivalent of what we would call very high up medals and so on and so forth. So when things under Hitler got very bad, he was so well respected in the community that he was a bit stubborn, I guess, and didn't think they needed to leave. And so they sent Bob to England to live with the rest of the family who knew enough to move on. And they did leave safely Stuttgart, but was only, if you can believe it, with the help of very high-ranking Nazis, which is always seems sort of amazing, but they got them out of the country. And then he became the physician in South Dayton, New York, which is not too far. It was part of the program of supplying physicians to a high-need area.
So
So
that how
then
he,
Bob came to this country when, I think he was in high school.
high school?
So he after the war was over, I'm pretty sure he was on the first ship. They had a name for it, Kinder something or other.
Yeah.
And so he went to South Dayton, and then they moved to go on to high school, and then on to the University of Michigan, and then eventually to medical school. And he was my resident. That's how I met him.
Oh, is that right?
When I was an intern, yeah, on EB 21, I think was the name of the ward at Buffalo General.
So you're a resident, are you working and reporting to Bob?
Pardon me?
Were you reporting to Bob as part of your residency? Was he?
Yeah, I guess you'd call it that. The ward had about 30, 35 patients, and there was a fellow intern, myself, and Bob was the resident. So the intern, well, as usual, the interns do the work, and the resident just comes by, and then the interns pass on the work sometimes to the senior medical student. But it worked out very well. We worked very hard because we worked every day and every other night, which is no longer allowed, as you know, because it's too much, I guess. And there was a big episode in New York City once when a poor resident or intern was so exhausted that made some, incorrect decisions in the emergency room. So they said, you can't work 24/7. You have to have time off to rest. But in those days, yeah, we worked every day and every other night. And as part of my residency, I worked every day and every other night. And then it finally got to second and third, so it became a little easier.
So that was the beginning of you working with Bob. Was that the beginning of a relationship then?
Over time, yeah, not then. We hardly had time, to, I was just describing the difficult program. But yeah, afterwards, I think our first date was going to an opera. And of all things, it was The Ring. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they give you time off for a meal, and then you come back.
Oh,
Wagner's The Ring, I think. Yeah, that was my first date. But I grew up with classical music in my home, so, with my parents. So anyway, pretty sure that was our first date.
And the rest of that of history, which we'll get back to. You mentioned your home classics. Your dad was a physician. Your mother was a pharmacist. Talk about your dad.
Well, my father was an immigrant, and he came from Sicily. Many people from Jamestown came from two areas in Sicily. One is a town called Tortorici, and the other one is Valedolmo. And my mother, who was born here, his family came from Valedolmo, which when we visited that, it's very much like Fredonia. Tomato plants all over the place, grapes, nice, lovely hills. And then the town of Tortorici, which is it's not too far from Mount Etna, and the volcano, and Catania, fairly close to that. He was very young. After his father died, the family, he was much younger. He was the youngest of many children. They all came to the country, but he was too young to come at the time. So he stayed with two aunts, and then when he was 14, and he had extremely good schooling, because the aunts were, I don't know how you would call it, they were actually nuns, but they lived in the home and worked in the community. They were not in a convent. They were very educated, so he had a very good education. So when he came to this country, they came to Jamestown, originally Fredonia, then Jamestown. Oh, no, sorry, that was my mom's family. He came to Jamestown, but then he went back to New York and got his high school equivalency at Brooklyn Academy. And then he went to New York University. And then eventually moved on to medical school in Buffalo and worked his way through that by being a barber. And then my
Really?
mother was, after he married my mother was a pharmacist. In those days, that was quite a meet. If my mom were alive today, she'd be, I think, 110 or 12.
Wow.
And so in those days, she went to, all those children of her siblings, they all went to postgraduate work, if you will. Yeah.
That's unbelievable in that time period.
Yeah, for a woman in
Yeah.
particular, I would say. Yeah, she became a pharmacist. So she worked while my dad went to medical school. And so
Was it-
between his barbering on the weekends, he was the barber, then he got through medical school. And you want to know something?
Sure.
I know you want to ask the question, but what's amazing, my first day in medical school in anatomy class, because I went to UB as he did, the pathologist who taught that course, he announced to the class and to me, "You're the first child of a student that I had."
Wow.
Some years back. His name was Samuel Saines. He was a very famous pathologist at UB. So that was nice.
Yeah, it was nice.
That was the only good part of anatomy, I think. But anyway,
Was there any question your dad was coming back here when he did his practice, when he decided to become a practitioner, that would they come back to Jamestown?
they came back to Jamestown. My mother had been raised here, and he had family here too by then. And he started his practice in the midst of the Depression. But it's hard for people to know what it was like practicing medicine in those days. First of all, it was very difficult to start up a practice in the Depression. Many people didn't have money, but that didn't interfere with his taking care of patients. And he
Right.
made many house calls as well as seeing patients in the office because many people were elderly. It was the Depression. They couldn't get to the office, and in some cases didn't speak English. So he made house calls a lot, day and night. Of course, that's not really done anymore. But things changed as the years went on, of course, as the emergency room, after so many years, became available to patients when they got sick. But otherwise, the primary emergency care was carried on at the home. So,
At that time, there were two hospitals, Jamestown General Hospital
That's
and
right.
WCA. Did your father work at both of them or one or
he
the other?
did. He worked at both, and he was president of the medical staff at each at different times, and also president of the Jamestown Medical Society. And guess what? He was the city physician.
Really?
I was talking to my sister yesterday just to remind me of a few facts. One of my sisters is a mathematician, so she remembers the dates, which I don't as well. And so he was the city physician for a while. And then my uncle, my mother's brother, was the city attorney to the mayor, my Uncle Tony Saley. Yeah.
No, say, yeah. Remind me afterwards, I have a letter from him.
My Uncle Tony?
Yeah,
Oh, no kidding.
yeah, it was in a file that Sherry Cadwell had, and
Oh, my goodness.
I didn't know that.
Did you know he was my uncle?
Not at all.
Oh, my goodness.
And he wrote a book that I have also.
He did.
Yeah,
He did. I have that book, too,
Okay, yeah.
signed by my uncle.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. There's quite the connection. So you've got your dad, a physician, you got your mother. Was she a practicing pharmacist?
She was until she had the three of us.
Okay.
And then thereafter, she did not.
So I'm
But by
visualizing.
the way, I don't mean to interrupt, but
Oh.
they in those days, she told us they made the pills. I mean, now
I'm
they
looking at the
sort of
bowl
come-
and that kind of thing. They do
Yeah.
grind
Yeah,
it and that
yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Amazing. They made the formularies themselves. Amazing, yeah. Things are a lot different now, for sure.
So how did your dad deal with 4 women?
Well, very well, I would say. Very, very well. He was a really outstanding person, not just because he was my dad, but just a wonderful guy. Very good to patients. And I could see that because I worked in the office a couple summers. I think maybe, I don't know if I was in high school or college at the time. I could see how he treated patients. He was a terrific role model, very soft-spoken. highly ethical person. I always wondered in retrospect as the fact that he had been raised by the two aunts who were nuns, as I told you about. He seemed to have a very kind of global understanding of people, men and women equally. So I don't know. He was just. We were lucky. We were lucky on both sides. My sisters and I, both of our parents.
So you went into medical training. Did your dad encourage that, or was that sort of a Lillian
No, my
decision?
dad did not encourage it. He didn't discourage me,
Right.
but he didn't overly encourage it. I remember when I finally told him I decided to apply, I remember him saying, "It's an awfully hard life, and it won't be easy,"
Right.
especially particularly with children, future children at that time he was telling me. But I was born at Jamestown General Hospital, and we lived on Allen Street at the time. And if you wanted to know where our house was, I would say that it was right across from St. James Church. Well, there's no homes in front of St. James Church, right? I mean, there's the expressway. So we had to move.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, I was going to the old Rogers Street School.
Yep.
And then when I was in first or second grade, that's when we had to move because the state took over. That was the great urban renewal, I guess,
Right, right.
A lot of people moved. The Lost Neighborhood, in a way, we were part of that, except my dad knew it was coming, and we moved out a little earlier than a lot of people absolutely had to.
Mm-hmm.
So so my sisters and I, for middle school, I guess you'd call it now, or junior high, we went to St. Peter and Paul's parochial school on West 5th. Do you remember?
I do.
It was on 5th Street there on the corner. And I don't understand it, but the nuns, every time a child would get hurt, no matter what, and I'm just a kid myself, like in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, they would say, bring so-and-so to Lillian. So somebody would bring this child to me, his, bleeding knee or something or whatever. And I mean, that was given things to clean it up and put Band-Aids on. I'm thinking, just because my dad's a doctor doesn't mean that I know how to take care of these things, but they were all minor. And I thought, well, gee, this is nice to help people out. And I think the example that we had at home of always trying to help people, my parents always said, both of them, maybe because they moved back here in the Depression, the community has been good to us, and we have to do everything we can to give back. And we were all taught that, really, not told that, but taught that. We could see it in action. So, and I was always interested in medicine, I really was. And my youngest sister is a nurse. She's retired now, but she went into nursing. And my middle sister was the smartest of everybody, and she became a mathematician. And the nice thing, one of my happy memories, and for my parents' sake as well as our own, in 1964, we all three graduated together from UB.
Ah,
I got my MD that day. Margaret got her master's in math, and Joette got her BS in nursing.
Oh.
And it was the same day, the same ceremony. I mean, it was totally unplanned,
Yeah.
but it all turned out that way, so it was very cool.
that's terrific.
Yeah,
So you graduated, you were a Jamestown High School graduate.
absolutely, as was my mother, and my two sisters, and my two daughters, and one granddaughter.
At the expense of asking, what year was your high school graduate class?
56.
56?
And I graduated from Wells College in 60. I'm pretty old. And then in 1964,
You hide it very well.
I graduated from medical school. And then I did a residency, 3 years, 1 year of internship, 2 years of medical residency, and then 2 years of cardiology fellowship.
Was there any question in either yours or Bob's mind that you were coming back here?
Not really, not really. I mean, I think Bob would have preferred maybe a little warmer climate. I remember him talking about, well, how about Virginia? But, we had both sets of grandparents nearby, and I just knew in my heart, if we were both going to do medicine, we wanted grandparents. We would have wanted grandparents relatively nearby, but it would be very important for them to be close and to be available and to be there for the children for our sake. So it all worked out really well. We were really lucky it worked.
Was there a practice here that you joined, or did you by yourself?
In those days, my father, who had his office on Allen Street on the first floor, we lived on the second floor, and then I mentioned that we had to move out because of urban renewal. He was one of the primary builders of the Prather Avenue Associates building on Prather Avenue.
Yeah.
So that when we moved back, we moved into that office. Bob did medicine and allergy, and I did internal medicine and cardiology. And then when my girls were 2 and 3, this goes back such a long way, Greg, that there was no medical practice, you know, like there is now, like, for example, JAMA, GLPP. And so it was very difficult to manage getting, you know, working all day and then getting out at night for an acute coronary care issue, and acute, my patients, acute myocardial infarctions. After a couple of years, Bob, who was trained in internal medicine but also allergy, was doing more and more allergy. So, and my dad was older. I didn't want, you know, I didn't want him to be working every night on my behalf. He had millions and millions of patients of his own. So I left practice, sadly. I say very sadly, because that was my first love, really.
Sure.
And went to work at the hospital. I worked part-time for a few years. I was the first person ever employed by WCA Hospital.
Really?
Murray Marsh was the administrator at the time, and I was so glad. He said, yeah, that'd be great. So I worked half-time, then I worked part-time. I put a cardiology department together. And then as time went on, the state required a medical director, so I became the medical director and then vice president of medical affairs. And then I retired when Bob was so ill.
Well, I think Bob eventually met every high school kid in the world who had every allergy test done.
I'm sure.
And
Yes.
I got a chance to see my cousin Tanya, who worked for Bob for many years.
Pardon me?
My cousin Tanya.
Oh, we're very close
Yeah,
to
yeah.
her, yes. I forgot she was your cousin. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. We loved, and then Carol Drake.
Carol Drake, that's
who
right.
worked here.
Right.
As you know, I remember
You recommended
given a
her.
reference, and I said there couldn't possibly be anybody any better, and you would agree that that's the way
Oh.
it turned out to be.
She was like the ultimate radar Riley. I mean, she was everywhere.
Yeah.
She was terrific. Again, your touch all over the place here. So you really go from the practice to really the administrative side, the kind of the other side of the table.
Yeah.
Was that a challenge for you, or was it just, was that a challenge?
Well, it was a challenge. It wasn't a challenge, and it was a challenge. For me, it wasn't a challenge because I could see the benefit of, rather than taking care of one patient, doing things, making policy for many patients was obviously a good thing to do. But being in direct care of a patient and then going to an administrative role, one had to be very sensitive to the physicians themselves. And I think it was more difficult for them seeing somebody whom I knew them all practically because my dad had known them all, and many of them were at our wedding, you know, and then here I am, you know, assuming a role there of sort of, you know, whatever, the medical director of all them. So, but I think it came out okay. It was difficult in some ways, but it was for the best. I did continue on with the course curriculum of American College of Physician Executives. And there were many, many hours. I took a lot of courses, and I learned a lot, too, of managing people. And so I even passed my third board exam. I had internal medicine, cardiology, and then physician executives. For some reason or other, about 5-10 years later, they disbanded that and just said you could get a certificate. I'm not really sure why. The American Board of Medicine probably didn't think it was maybe strict enough. I'm not sure what happened politically because I was just here working. But I was glad to have done it, and I don't know if you were part of this, but I met a wonderful physician who was a strategist and a futurist from the University of Colorado. And Leland Kaiser was his name. And he understood the importance of the whole community getting together to make changes and to do strategy. So we got him into town. I was with the Gebby at that time. They could see the importance of that, and we could see the importance of getting the boards of many organizations together, not just the executive director, but the boards. And so we had the legislature, the councils, we had all the the philanthropic boards, the not-for-profit boards, the school boards. Everybody got together, and we had a lot of the big events at Chautauqua. I bet you were there.
I was.
I mean, yeah. And so that was what I learned while I was doing the medical director part, yeah.
So I always think about that, many people who might even been union officers or on the floor, all of a sudden go into management. It's
Exactly.
like going into the dark side, you know?
That's exactly right.
And not always everybody appreciates that.
Right, and you may not be forgiven for it either,
Yeah.
you know, by the people, but it seemed to work okay. I got a lot of, how would you say, feedback personally, because I knew that, for example, I did a lot of work in quality assurance. That was all brand new many years ago at that time, and I did a lot of teaching of nurses and physicians, you know, and I could see that it would do patients good as a group, as a whole. So I felt as though it was meaningful and worthwhile. I really did. And so, although I love direct patient care, nothing could take that place, but one can't, you know, my career sort of changed in medicine as my children were growing up, if you know what I mean, different times. And that was the very primary concern for me, that I would have enough time with them. So, and I was glad that WCA Hospital was there and was willing to, you know, have me be there part-time in the beginning. I went through many iterations. I was a director of wellness in the beginning, and then director of cardiology. And the foundations, by the way, were wonderful. And all the equipment for cardiac rehab and for the cardiac diagnostic labs were gifts to the hospital. Can you believe this? I remember a member of the Gebby Foundation called me and said, and I knew him growing up, he was a physician, he said, "What do you need?" I mean, you know, there are many blessings came my way, let's put it that way.
You were the first female in a lot of positions. And when you went to medical school, I suspect there weren't a lot of females in your medical class.
No, now that you mention it, no. I think we might have graduated 5 out of a class of about 120. Yeah, and some of them didn't, a couple of them didn't finish, I don't think, but yeah. But I had gone to a women's college, you know, in those days, you know, that was between 56 and 60. It was much more common for a woman who really wanted to do education or get educated, I guess would be a better way of putting it, to go to a women's college, and I did. And so, and I majored in a course curriculum called pre-medicine, which now nobody ever has, because you can't go to graduate school by just doing the courses that you need for medical school. You know, you have to have a major, or biology or chemistry or whatever. But I had a very strong liberal arts education, for which I'm grateful for every single day. And then I had, you know, the prerequisites of medical school. And the first year of medical school was, I thought, extremely difficult. I was scared to death in anatomy class. He used to ask us in a very loud voice the answer to these difficult questions. I was quaking in my boots the entire time.
Yeah.
And in those days, I was at the end of the alphabet, and so I had 2 partners. Everybody had 3 partners, so there were groups of 4 with each cadaver. And that was difficult, I guess is the best word for that. And then one of my 2 partners for the cadaver, he only went to 1 class and he left. He was a philosophy major. And I don't blame him, but, well, I mean, I understood why he didn't care for it. And he never came back. He dropped out of the class, so there was just 1 person and me. So that was very, very hard, because everybody had 2 on one side and 2 on the other side of this poor cadaver. And I thought I'd never get through gross anatomy. I always wondered why they did it the way they did, which I won't go into anymore, in case anybody ever wants to look at this video. But, you know, I don't think it was totally necessary. It was like joining a fraternity or something, maybe. I don't know.
Well, as a fraternity of physicians and it's somewhat of an exclusive group, did you, and basically a male group, I mean, it's a man's club, and you're not. And
Yeah, right.
did you feel that at all? Did you get any sense at that
You
time?
know, that's the odd thing that I think about today. I never did, and I have no idea why. I really don't. The attending physicians, you know, the regular doctors who were mentoring and teaching us, like each ward would have a few attending physicians. They would make rounds with the house staff, which would be us and the medical students. They were always very helpful, very kind. I never noticed anything that one even reads about now, and as the years have gone on, issues of harassment or whatever. Never.
Yeah.
I never did. Maybe it was just so early on. I have no idea really why. It all worked out. We worked in groups then, not just the cadaver, but other groups like in bacteriology or chemistry. And I have friends to this day who we keep in touch from medical school and so on. Many of the men were much more programmed for medical school than I was. I deliberately, you know, took a very liberal arts education on purpose, and I'm so glad I did. That worked out anyway at the time. Many of them had been really working for things, you know. So the first year we had a course the only course I found difficult in medical school was biostatistics, and you know, they all knew it backwards and forwards, and so I just sort of studied and kept to myself and so on. And a lot of them, that was the one thing, they knew each other before, maybe they were from the same college, you know, and then they would sort of work together. And in the beginning only in the beginning I felt a little left out, but as time went on I was good. And in the clinical years, the last 2, I loved those because we were with patients and then learning diseases and how it affects the body and so on. So I loved all that. I had a very good training at the University of Buffalo, I really did. And I was an intern at Buffalo General, and we went to all the hospitals, Roswell for 1 month or 2, the VA for 1 month or 2, Meyer, the old Meyer, which is now different name, ECMC, and then Buffalo General for the majority of it. And our chief of medicine was from Yale, and he invited me actually to go there for a residency. Now you've got to remember now when this was in the early 60s. And I thought, I mean, Yale for my medical training, you know, would have been terrific. But I decided against it.
Yeah.
I knew I wanted to come back here. I felt I probably did anyway at that point. And I just thought, I don't know what it would be like to be at Yale. I know everybody here, I felt comfortable. I think I was just scared to go. So I thanked him many times over for recommending me, because he said, I would love to have you go as an example of what we can do here in Buffalo and who we produce, but I stayed. And I'm grateful that I think I probably made the right choice God only knows what I would have turned out like
But
if
that,
I'd gone there.
that's the road, that's that fork. Everybody sort of has at some
Uh-huh.
point one or two decision-making points, and that was one of yours. With that liberal arts background, which coupled with the medical background and the career path you took, do you get a sense that that's one of the reasons why you became inclined to do community activities? You know, you're amazing resume of things, but it had to start someplace where you went from balancing the mother role, balancing the wife role, the doctor role, and putting your toe into the community stuff.
Well, I think probably, yeah, I think so. And I think my upbringing had something to do with it in terms of giving back to the community, like our parents always taught us. And I also think the circumstances were such that I didn't take a big role out in the community without sharing whether it was okay with my employer at the time, which was the hospital. And that's one thing I always give credit and appreciate Murray Marsh, who was the administrator, for giving me the go-ahead. It never interfered with my work, you know, at the hospital. I always gave it my all the years I worked there. And Bob was very supportive. And you got to remember there were many years. I mean, I really didn't get hugely busy in my career at the hospital. Remember now, I wasn't taking care of patients after I left. I was seeing them in consultation and doing stress tests and echoes and things like that, but I wasn't taking care of them when I moved to the hospital. So when my girls were in like college, my career ramped up. I think a lot of male counterparts, maybe by the time I was that age, were maybe slowing down a little bit, having had, you know, the height of their career maybe in their 30s and 40s. But when my kids were in college, I had the time. Bob was working all the time, so I accelerated in my career at that time and took on leadership positions like vice president of medical affairs and medical director. You know, I think a lot of that just happened through the years, gradually. And I loved working with people. There's a lot of excellent people who do wonderful community work. And over the past 10, 12 years, as I tried to step back from a lot of my responsibilities in the non-for-profit world, I was able to work in the nominating process of these organizations and in the governance committees. So I was able to encourage younger people to take on roles in the board, and then over time, as they became knowledgeable about the workings of the board, really to take on leadership positions. So when I stepped down from two major boards that I was on for many years, the Jamestown Renaissance Corporation, and also Jamestown City Center Development Corporation, which is the arena. There are outstanding people in place, and you know, I'm proud of being able to have sort of mentored and encouraged and, you know, asked them to be on the board and so on and so forth. So, you know, I'm happy for the directions that they're all taking. I really am. I'm still involved with some things, the Board of Health. It just seems as though that's hardly the time to retire during a pandemic, and I love the work of the Board of Health, and also a physicians group that's meeting during the pandemic, and Jamestown Community College. I'm back on the board of that. I was on it some years ago and was president then, but then I became president of the city council, and I was worried that there might be a perception there, you know, of just of conflict. So I stepped down from the board at that time, but then I was reinstated some years later. So, by the way, when you were asking me about what was it like to be an administrator versus a provider of care, I think it gave me experience and a courage to run for city council, after working with all the doctors, after I became the medical director. I thought that was good training ground to be on the city council. Anyway, just throwing that in.
Exactly. I'm reading from an article, when you were named Woman of the Year, and they quoted Mary Ann McElrath, your very close friend.
Yes.
And she went on to be quoted as saying, people in her practice have watched the very public doctor make her way from cardiologist to grieving widow to city council president. If she lost a child, other people might not see me getting back on track. Somebody like Lillian is so visible. People saw her, and it gave them courage. I think that's an accurate statement. Do you reflect on that? I mean, you went your arc of a career in a very short period of time, having lost Allison and tragically, and then Bob shortly thereafter. It would have been easy to go in a couple directions.
Right. Well, I think a little hard to express in a few words. I think when you go through the dark night of the soul, like you do if you lose a child, I mean, if you get through it, in one piece, which you don't ever forget, and your life is changed forever, but I didn't work after she passed away for 6 months. In fact, I think Murray thought I was never really actually being able to go back, but I couldn't go back until those 6 months. And at those times, during those months, I did a lot of grieving and praying and meditating and taking care of the rest of us that were left, myself and Bob and Auburn. And Bob was ill at the time, and of course that grief, what it does to the immune system is tough, and so his health declined, and he died, as you mentioned, 4 years later. A few years after that, Jim McElrath, who was my husband's best friend, Mary Ann's husband, and we were best couple friends, asked me to run with him on city council. And if I had been in my right mind, I probably would not have done that. I mean, I don't think I made a bad choice. That's not what I mean. I mean, ordinarily, my exposure to the city council while working in my career was headlines in the paper about blue garbage bags they were arguing about. Remember years ago, something to do with a different color garbage bag? And I thought, what are these people thinking of, But honestly, I don't know how to explain this, but it's like you've had electric therapy to your brain, when you have a tragedy like that, to lose a child. And we were soulmates, Allison and I, so it was a tremendous blow. Anyway, so I think somehow or other I agreed to do that, which I say in retrospect, I'm kind of surprised, because ordinarily I would have thought, well, you can't please everybody, it'll be hard, people will be yelling at you for this, that, and the other. I mean, ordinarily, if I'd been in my right mind, I would have said, I don't think after all that's happened to me, I want to go into any kind of aggravating situation, but I did. And I guess I think, although I haven't thought about this in a while, I think I thought that nothing could have been as bad as what I had been through. So I guess maybe that just gave me the resolve to say, well, let's do it. So I immersed myself in that, and to be honest with you, I liked it very much. I really did. It was good to be thinking about something like the city and its relationships versus maybe my internal suffering, I don't know. But as colleagues, we got along very well, and I enjoyed my time. After 8 years, several of us stepped down who were on the city council. So after the 8 years we did, and we had a great time. I used a lot of experiences that I had had earlier, like when we were first elected, we were not sworn in yet, so we were able to get together, that is, for purposes of the public, it's okay to get together, and
Yep.
we weren't even inducted, as it were, into city council. So we had a strategic planning session, and I think we had it at RTPI. We had a facilitator, and it taught me something really important, that everybody, no matter what sort of party they were part of, they all had the same vision for the city and the same concerns and the same hopes. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Everybody, no matter what. So we could always remind ourselves that, we all want the same thing, so there's no point in fighting, over things because of one party versus another. I mean, that held through pretty well, I think, the whole time we were on council. Jim and I tried to set the stage for that, so.
Well, and you were president of the council for 4 years, half of that time.
I was for part of that time, yeah, and I look back at those, I learned a lot about the city and so on, and at the same time, it was a little awkward there for a while, by the way, because at the time, I was president of the Gebby, I was president of the city council, and I don't know if I don't think JCCDC was formed. No, JRC wasn't formed then. And so I remember there was a radio show that some lady would, you remember Ray Hall's show?
I do.
Oh, goodness, he was, one day I mentioned at the BPU board meeting something about broadband or something, and about whatever, and of course he was with a radio,
JTN.
Altel, I think, at the time.
Oh, yes, he was, yes,
Right.
as a
And
professional.
so, I didn't know I was saying anything that would be like enough to upset anybody, but I mean, he would talk on the radio and stuff. And there was a woman who always called into that show who said, as president of the Gebby, I shouldn't be president of the council, that it was a conflict. And so, I mean, those are the things that sort of bother you when you hear everybody in the world hearing all these things, you know what I mean? But one of his end programs, this I found very hard, but anyway, one of his end programs, I got a call from the manager of the BPU who said, guess what? He's saying wonderful things about you. And I mean, up to them, that's a big thing, because prior to that, it was always not good, you know what I mean? And I wasn't doing anything bad, but it just wasn't never good. And, but I missed the show that day, so I never heard it. So anyway.
Yeah, Ray had an opinion. He had his strong opinions about
Yeah.
stuff, never fully understood. As you kind of hearken back on, whether it was city council or Gebby Foundation, the medical facilities, some of this are somewhat, they intersect because of the good of the city of Jamestown, but there's some things, Lillian, that you're kind of most proud of, saying, this was an idea which I don't like to talk about much, but this is one where it was conceived, and through relationships, it happened. Where you can say, kind of that highlight reel.
Oh, that's kind of hard to do, I think, Greg. I don't know. I genuinely enjoyed all the different organizations that I was involved with. I mean, family has always been number one and critical to me. That's why I changed from my love, which was private practice and taking care of patients, in order to, and went to the hospital. I mean, because my decision was made because of my kids, and I just thought, I can't not spend the time that I need to. And my husband, by the way, was a very solid sleeper, so I was out in the middle of the night in the ICU, and I was scared to death that one of them would get sick and he wouldn't hear them, So I mean, I had to make a change, and I did. But I made the best of that. I loved that. I think one thing I'm proud of in addition to both of my girls, and my grandchildren, which are the love of my life, of course, are the people that I've worked with through the years and who have helped make things happen. That's what I feel the best about. And one of whom was in the room earlier today. Yeah, there was one thing that popped in my mind while I was, and the fact that there were, by the way, that there was no medical group. One of the reasons why I was on call for my own patients every single night and every single weekend, unless we were out of town, is some years later, I coordinated the coming together of Jamestown Area Medical Associates, JAMA. And I guess I am proud of that, because those guys needed to get together. And we had talked about it, they had talked about it. At one time, we wanted to forge a relationship, this is while I was still at the hospital, between the hospital and the doctors, because that would have been ideal. That was what places were doing, who were progressive, and they were combining forces and getting an outpatient center instead of doing minor surgery in the surgical suite, all those kinds of things. But after Bob got so ill that I stopped working, Bert Rappel called me up and said, now you've got to put the group together because you'll have time. I said, oh, time? I said, you know, I spent a lot of time in hospitals with Bob, you know, I want to be available. That's why I couldn't be working 60 hours a week as VP of Medical Affairs at the hospital. I have to be free. And he said, well, do it in between. And Bob, thank God, had a period of time there that he was not in the hospital those last few months. So I had been to all those courses I told you about for physician and management. And so I put things together. Just because, to make it go smoothly, they hired an attorney from out of town that nobody knew. Interestingly enough, he had a place at Chautauqua.
Yeah.
And so he would come to Chautauqua in the summer. I love that connection, too.
Sure.
So he put the group together, even though it was out of state, in order to just make it, you know, like fair and even for everybody. And that group, that was one of the hardest things I've done, when I think about it, is to put them, because they were all very good and independent thinking physicians, and they came together for JAMA. And then, which, by the way, Bob, my husband, Bob, thought of the name, JAMA.
Okay.
And the copyright was okay with, because, you know, there's the Journal of the American Medical Association, but something to do with the periods or the lack of or whatever, so it worked. And, yeah. And so then some years later, as you know, they went with UPMC. So it's now JAMA GLPP. But that was important, I think, for the community to finally, and by the way, my kids were, I think, in college or greater or more at the time. So if I had waited around for the medical group, you know what medical groups do.
Yeah.
One night you're on call, the next guy's on call, another night, et cetera, and you have every third weekend, every other weekend off. Medicine is very different, now, as you know.
Yep.
There are people who work in their offices and other people who work only in the hospitalists. So I've seen a big change through the years in medicine from the days where my dad was doing house calls, you know, as well as seeing patients in his office. So a lot of changes. But that was something that was worthwhile putting together, I think.
I lived through some of that because of my relationship with WCA Hospital from the legal side with Sherry Cadwell, and I kind of was involved in that, including way back when the Jamestown General Hospital merger aspect of it,
Yeah.
which was very contentious and difficult.
Very much so.
Were you on the council, the city council then?
No. I was a young practicing physician and was not involved. I always thought it was very sad that this kind of thing was going on. But the only thing I remember about the whole situation was the city was bleeding money or
Yeah.
something of that sort, and that seemed to be a tragedy to me. But it's, once again, change is extremely difficult, and I'm positive there are still hard feelings in a lot of the older staff that are still around. But I wasn't involved in any of it. I probably would have been praying if I had been at the seat of the boards, trying to put them together, finding a way to make it go more peacefully, but.
Well, it was an interesting time. Myself and Rick Sotier, Sherry kind of also guiding it with, and Murray and Ron Frizzell, and it was just sort of I didn't appreciate at the time how cataclysmic it was, but it was
Oh,
very.
yes. Oh, yes. And thank God that you were all working towards a common end.
Yeah.
And now things are so different. It's not really a local hospital in the sense that we knew it as.
Yeah.
But it's a good hospital. They're very devoted to high quality. That's the important thing, even though there are issues here and there, and the staff gets a little despondent from what I've told. But the other thing I was happy that I did, and I really didn't want to, but I felt it would be good for the community, is I chaired the capital campaign for the new emergency department.
Yes, yes.
And I had long left the hospital. And, you know, there were things that were sort of left with us, like a beloved administrator left the hospital, as you probably know, John, and that was difficult on the staff.
Very.
And instead of making rounds on my half of the hospital, that we divided it up, he'd do one half, I'd do the other half. I did it all, so I had to go to work a lot earlier in the morning just to help the staff out because they were pretty devastated. So there were those kinds of things that I remembered when I was chosen, as it were, and I didn't volunteer in any way for that, but they had a facilitator talk to many people in the community, and there was a lot of discussion. I was asked if I would do that, and I understood how important that might be. At least they said it would be, and so I did it, and I did it all 100%, you know, in a positive way, and that was something I remember as being good for the community. So I'm glad that it all happened that way. I'm proud of having done it.
Well,
And the people who helped in the campaign cabinet and everything, you know how the United Way
Right.
has their, this was a campaign cabinet too. And the people who worked so hard on that, my hat was off to them, yeah. We did a good job.
well, it's, to me, in preparing for this conversation, many people called, as I mentioned at the outset, and gave me advice, all of with mentioned that you were their mentor. And whether it was, and a couple of them were here today, and many would love to come and at some point have a community hug post-COVID. But that's really one of the great legacies of Lillian Ney. And I don't know that you fully probably appreciate all that, but you've touched so many lives in so many areas, and willing freely to share advice. And that's a real compliment.
Oh, thank you, Greg.
Okay. Well, you knew you were coming today. You actually accepted coming to be interviewed. In anticipation of that, wondered if you expected a question that I might ask that I haven't.
Are you asking me if there's a question you didn't ask that I thought you would?
Yeah.
I honestly, knowing you as I do, I honestly had no idea how this was going to go. I really didn't. I wasn't sure. I had a feeling you'd ask about Allison or it would come up. But there's really nothing else is there a question you wish you had asked or would wish you had asked after we finished?
Have you done this? Well, yeah, and it's unrelated to most anything of life, but I think of Bob Ney and I think of the St. Louis Cardinals. And I don't know why I do that, whether he had a hat one time or whether that, or was there any connection?
St. Louis Cardinals?
Yeah.
No, of course, I'm not up so much on baseball, but it's a baseball team, right?
Yeah, baseball team, yeah.
Sorry to ask the question, but yeah.
So,
No, I don't think so. He was a very, very, how do you say it, a fervent Bills fan. Oh, my goodness, he never missed a game.
Yeah.
Finally, after all the bad weather and the rain I'd sit through, I'd ask him to take somebody else because but he loved the Bills. Of course, we lived through the Bills when they were at the Super Bowl a couple times, you know, so, and he always stuck by him. And then, of course, Michigan, he would always have, Jim Abdallah would come over. They were both the University of Michigan
Yeah,
grads.
go Blue,
To
yeah.
listen to, oh my goodness, to listen to the football games. And I find they would get so animated and upset about various plays on the football field that I have to go in the basement to read, you know, because it was so loud. But they loved their University of Michigan for sure.
You were also on the board with Chautauqua, with my wife at the time, and Maureen, who introduced you. And that's sort of a tourism destination extraordinary. Had Chautauqua, was that part of your life when you were growing up? In your dad, did he take you?
Oh, yes, oh, yes. Yeah, we went to all the operas. I think I mentioned briefly earlier, my dad and mother were very interested in classical music, and especially opera. And yeah, all of us would be dragged, as it were. But of course, we came to love it naturally. But in the beginning, every Friday night, we would go to the opera at Chautauqua. And years ago, and you probably remember yourself, we had a lot of operas during the summer, 6, 8, whatever. And they had them on Monday nights too, but my dad couldn't go on Monday nights because his practice, but on Friday nights at the end of the week, we were able to go, so yeah. And I remember we went to concerts in the amphitheater then, but they were mostly singers. I think is it Lena Horne, who was from Bradford, Pennsylvania? Very famous.
Yes, Lena Horne.
alto.
Lena Horne, yeah.
She gave a big concert there, and we went there. And so, yeah, Chautauqua was part of my young life there. And then we spent, when our girls were, I think, 11 and 12 maybe, we started living at Chautauqua every summer. And my mom came with us, and it was wonderful. She loved Chautauqua so much. She went to church every morning at the little church for the Catholic service, and then took a veil of, various things. She was the first one who introduced us to Sister Joan Chittister, who was a wonderful speaker for the religion series at the Hall of Philosophy. And Bob and I would leave Mom and the girls and come down here to work. And then we would go back at the end of the day, and then we'd all go to the concert in the evening.
Yeah.
So that was a nice life, and our girls participated in work. I mean, Aubin was cleaning the amphitheater at 6 in the morning, and Allison was involved with the main gate, and then parking when she was very young. I mean, before, I think maybe 14, helping out with parking when we used to. Do you remember for the opera, we used to park behind Norton?
I do.
And you have to really, she told me something once. She said, Mom, you wouldn't believe some of the people get so upset when they're told they can't park at a certain place. She said, and you know some of them. Well, I said, I don't want to know. I don't want to know who it is. But, we were there the day for the first Soviet the exchange. And if that wasn't an emotional day when these people got off the bus, I'll never forget as long as I live. Before the Iron Curtain, the whole, that very
I was
first
there
one.
also, I remember that.
Yeah, and people were crying. And Allison became very interested in that to the extent that when she was by then, I think, working in the administration building. Joe Johnson had called her once, and they were on vacation. She had graduated, I think it was the summer that Aubin graduated from college, and then she was a year behind. But because somebody had left the administration office, and I think it was in the recreation department, and they needed her right away. So she came back early, and she worked the rest of the summer. She ended up by majoring in Russian and international relations in college, and she spent her junior year in Russia. This was all because of the Chautauqua experience. I'm quite positive of it. She helped when the next event was at the University of Pittsburgh. You remember that one for a week?
Yeah.
She worked with Chautauqua. She got a leave from school from college, for that week to go and work with the Chautauqua people to pull that off. And she was working at the Brookings Institute eventually when she passed away.
What did she want?
In Russian.
Yeah.
Russian.
Was that her career move? I mean, it
Yeah.
kind of.
Oh, yes. So Chautauqua has had a huge impact on our lives, I would say.
Well, I remember when the bus came, and what I remember specifically is one of the ambassadors from Russia was the cosmonaut Tereshkova. And I had my little daughter Megan with me, and we went up to her because she got out of the bus and just sort of standing by herself. But I mean, she is the first woman in space. I mean, Tereshkova.
Wow.
And she stood there, and I, introduced my daughter, whatever. She understood enough English, and she signed an autograph and took a picture and all that stuff. But I thought that was just really cool to even thought that we'd at time would ever come.
Unbelievable,
You'd have a
yeah.
Russian in America, first of all, and let alone Chautauqua.
Right. Right, and I remember the next time a group came, I took the physicians that were with them and gave them a tour of the hospital. And I remember them being so amazed. Well, the ticketing system at Chautauqua, they could only relate it to, visas that you have in Russia at that time. If you went from town to town, you had to show papers. They had to get permission before.
Yeah.
And so I with the language difference, it was hard to explain to them that this was not as onerous as that. But maybe they thought it was, I don't know.
Well, the biggest giggle of when I had a big John Denver, stuff and all of that first year, a guy named Vladimir Posner spoke, and he
yes.
could speak English very well, but he was a journalist. And
I remember him.
He was kind of tongue-in-cheek saying, yeah, you talk about America free and can move around so easily, liberally. I noticed I had to go through a gate and I had to show my credentials. You told me about America.
Exactly, same as the docs. They said the same thing. Oh, wow. And hard to squirm out of that one.
No, he nailed it, man. He picked up on it right away.
Yeah.
So it was great. Well, you've been great. This is fabulous. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for asking me. I appreciate it. It's nice to reminisce, too, in many ways, yeah.
Well, thank you.